Let me begin by welcoming you to the University of Pittsburgh's European Union Center of Excellence and our conversation on Europe. We began this series in 2012, so now we're in our second decade, and I'm delighted to be leading the series. My name is Randall Halle, and I'm the Director of the European Studies, the Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence here at Pitt. Our center and the series is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. And so I wanted to thank them for that funding, but I also want to thank Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole and Kathleen Brett for their wonderful and invaluable help with today's conversation on Europe and all the many events that are taking place in our center. Speaking of which, please visit our website, which we will be putting in the chat. We have a rich archive of previous conversations on Europe on various topics. The last was the Polish elections, as well as announcements for upcoming conversations. In 2 weeks, on November 30th, our EU enlargement series will be devoted to Slovakia, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. And next month, we'll be convening to have a conversation with Director and Head of the European Film Academy, Agnieszka Holland, to consider her recent work and the general state of European cinema. Today, however, we're changing our format a bit from a conversation on Europe. Today is a conversation on Africa and Europe, and I'm joined by my colleague, Catherine Koverola, as co-moderator. Catherine is director of our Center for African Studies here in the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. Catherine, thank you for joining in, and thank you for making this possible, and I'm really happy that our two centers can be collaborating on this. For those in the audience, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Feel free to post a question at any time during the discussion. We recommend that you use the Q&A rather than the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. We might be working them into the discussion or posing them directly. 2023 is this, speaking of anniversaries, 2023 is the 60th anniversary of the Yaoundé Convention. It was a trade agreement that set relations in place with decolonizing African states between Europe and Africa. This anniversary gives us an opportunity to reflect on Africa-EU relations in the past and the present. We have gathered with us for colleagues, for experts, and what we're going to do is we'll sort of give each of them, we'll introduce each of them and give them an opportunity to sort of respond to the topic from their various areas of expertise, and then we'll open it up to a general conversation. So at this moment, then I'll turn it over to Catherine to begin the conversation here.
Thank you so much, Randall. It is really a pleasure for the Center for African Studies to be invited to participate with our good colleagues in the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Now more than ever is an important time for us to be having intellectual discourse over the issues that are facing the world. And so at the University of Pittsburgh, one of the things that's really important for us is to provide forums and opportunities for discourse and dialogue to deepen our understanding and to our understanding of history and how that ties into contemporary times. And so I'm personally really thrilled to be doing this webinar together with my good colleagues. And our entire Center for African Studies really embraces these opportunities. And with that, I would like to begin by introducing our first panelist, a wonderful colleague, Dr. Pernille Røge. She is Associate Professor and Associate Chair for the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Røge is a historian of the early modern French colonial empire with a particular interest in political economy, slavery, and abolition. Her book, Economists and the Reinvention of Empire, France in the Americas and Africa, 1750 to 1802, explores efforts to reinvent the French colonial empire between the mid-18th century and the rise of Napoleon. She currently works on a study of the economic ideas in the French Americas and a trans-imperial history of the early modern Danish colonial empire. Alongside her research, she enjoys teaching Pitt students in European history and convening Pitt's Early Modern Worlds Initiative. And it was my pleasure during this past year to travel to West Africa, Senegal in particular, with my dear colleague. And so it's really a privilege and an honor to introduce you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me well? Yeah, great. So thanks so much, Catherine, for that kind introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to participate alongside such wonderful co-panelists. Thank you also to Randall and Catherine both for inviting me, and to Ingrid and Kathleen for all the work you've done to organize this webinar. So as you just heard, I'm coming at this topic as an early modern historian. So what I can perhaps offer as we're here to mark the Yaoundé Conventions 60 years on is this long-term historical perspective on African-European relations as it relates to notions of development and aid agreements that are central to the Yaoundé Convention. And I really think that the notion of development is critical here, because development has allegedly been a mediating factor in African-European relations for a very long time, hundreds of years before the Yaoundé Convention. In some ways, its history goes as far back as the notorious transatlantic slave trade, and moves then through several stages of European colonial scrambles for Africa, and through the era of decolonization and European integration, all the way to present-day development programs and packages. So you may wonder, how exactly did it mediate relations between Europe and Africa during the transatlantic slave trade? Well, between the 16th and 19th centuries, Europeans shipped over 12 million African men, women, and children across the Atlantic to toil and die on plantations in the Americas in order to produce cash crop commodities such as sugar, coffee, cotton, indigo, cacao, or to work in silver mines, all under brutal labor regimes. But to justify their slave trading business and slavery, slave traders and the European states who supported them, they used a discourse of development here through Christian salvation, baptism, and the virtues of coming under European servitude, rather than being, in their words, eternally doomed to what Europeans described as savagery in Africa. The slave trade and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants in the New World thereby steadily fueled a growing vision in Europe of the African continent as savage and undeveloped, and a self-image of Europe as being at the forefront of development. Now, at this stage of European expansion, the African continent itself was not the main object of European interest. It was only its peoples, and particularly their labor power. However, by the second half of the 18th century, we begin to see a shift in interest towards the continent of Africa itself. Because from this time, particularly political economists in Europe begin to argue that the use of African slave labor in the New World is both not very productive, but also not very humane. So in their view, it would be better if Europe started developing cash crop commodities on the African continent, where you would have fertile and uncultivated land. So Europe, they argue, could develop the same kinds of cash crops that they were receiving from the Americas in West Africa in particular, tap into local labor regimes and local labor systems, and that would then allow them to avoid the transatlantic slave trade and avoid slavery in the Americas altogether. Coupled with these ideas was an insistence that doing so would enable Europe to help the African continent develop a thriving agriculture and develop markets for European manufactured goods. So in the words of these political economists of the mid-1750s, it would allow them to bring civilization to Africa. And this is a concept that they formulate in the mid-50s to describe this process. So already in the late 18th century, we begin to see what we can call an early scramble for Africa, the continent itself, in which some of the European colonial powers, they start experimenting with cash crop cultivation in Africa by obtaining land grants from local rulers. And they do so in direct competition with each other, always checking what the other colonial empire is doing at this point in time. So when we get to the 19th century, there is therefore already a growing developmental discourse in Europe, at the heart of which is a desire to colonize Africa in order to exploit its lands and people and set up a system in which Europeans can acquire raw materials and new markets for its manufactured goods. Now, the 19th century is, of course, also the area of European industrialization, medical advances, pseudoscientific racism and Darwinism, and all of these, they contribute to a strengthening of a heightened European sense of superiority vis-a-vis Africa. Now, many European powers argue that they not only can help Africa develop, they can do so through colonization, and they should do so, preferably before any other of their European powers do it. So this is when we begin to see the official scramble for Africa between 1885 and 1914, when European powers bring 90% of the African continent under colonial rule. And they do so framing their activities as a duty or a calling. So the French, they call it la mission civilisatrice, their mission to civilize, or the British call it a white man's burden, and so on. But these terms are also shared by many other European powers at this point. Now, notions of development, as we know from the Yaoundé Conventions, and as I think one of our colleagues will talk about shortly, that continue to mediate European-African relations through the colonial period, but also during decolonization. And indeed, development remains critical to African-European relations still. So, as we on this panel consider the role of development, we therefore need to acknowledge this long, complicated, and often violent history that comes with it. And I think we need to ask three important questions. What is development? Who gets to dictate what it constitutes? And at the end of the day, who is development supposed to serve? So those are my 5 minutes, Catherine. I hope that was okay to get the conversation going.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Pernille.
Indeed, it certainly did get the conversation going, and those are three further wonderful questions. And I have to say that actually, from my own thinking, you've just changed everything that I've been thinking about in general in trying to actually make a kind of distinction between a colonial project and a developmental project, colonialism and developmentalism. And so I really appreciate the long history that you've given us and that kind of correction to my own thinking. So with that, maybe we'll turn to our other historian on the panel, and that is Michael Odije. Dr. Odije is a research associate at the University College London, who is working on the AFRAB project, African Abolitionism, the Rise of Transformations of Anti-Slavery in Africa. He holds a BA from Ambrose Ali University in Nigeria, and an MA and PhD from the University of Sheffield. He spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of African Studies at the University of Cambridge, and has published in many ways on topics that indeed correspond well to what Pernille was just describing to us. For instance, his article on cocoa and child slavery in West Africa in the Oxford Encyclopedia of African History, the political origin and persistence of industrial policy in Africa that he published in Globalizations, and numerous other articles that have direct impact on the conversation for today. So Michael, if I could ask you to bring us a little bit more into out of the early modern and more into the modern period, and help us follow up with what Pernille was describing to us.
Thank you very much, Professor Randall. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the European Studies Center for extending this invitation. So not to waste time, I think maybe I should start from where the previous speakers stopped. So my remark today will provide a sort of brief historical overview of the trade partnership between European Union and African countries, where the European Union uses this term of development to either justify or to explain the trade partnership. So I'll discuss this from a sort of modern historical to the present, questioning whether the agreement or this development partnership have fulfilled their promises. So the observations that I'm making in my short presentation are from West African perspective. I believe it is challenging to discuss the trade partnership from an entirely neutral standpoint. So my standpoint is from West Africa. So the history of this trade partnership, I think, goes back to, say, the Treaty of Rome. So I just decided now to start from where she stopped. So the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957. This treaty established the European Economic Community, EEC. So the part 4 of the treaty included a sort of special relationship with the colonies of the integrating European countries. France played a crucial role in ensuring that the EEC maintained a special relationship with its colonies. At the time, France had a trade system of paying more for raw materials from countries like Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mali, French colonies, while these countries imported less competitive French finished goods. So you have this pattern of trade that the previous speaker talked about. So however, between 1958 and 1961, most African countries gained independence. So in 1961, there was a sort of French partnership agreement with former colonies. So the Yaoundé Convention of 1963 then became the foundation for continuing this sort of late colonial French model. So from the West African viewpoint, under the Yaoundé Convention, the EEC offered preferential access and paid more for raw materials like cocoa and coffee from associated African countries. My research highlighted how this led to decrease in economic and political crisis, decrease in threats to political elite survival, as well as economic diversification. They are all linked. So through my research, I have scrutinized this dynamic by comparing West African countries that were associated with the Yaoundé Convention and the ones that were not. So the ones that were associated had less political crisis, less economic crisis, less diversification, while the ones that were not associated had more sort of economic crisis and more diversification. There's a link between these things. So Yaoundé Convention lasted until 1975-76. Meanwhile, in 1973, Britain joined the EEC, bringing in former British colonies like Nigeria and Ghana. Now, the Lomé Convention of 1976 was a turning point because it occurred during the 1973 commodity crisis that was caused by oil crisis. So the EEC used Lomé Convention of 1976 to address this crisis by creating a price stabilization fund and something called protocol, where it sometimes paid twice the market value of certain raw materials. The effect of this in West Africa is it led to a misallocation of resources, with production resources being diverted to this, if you like, EEC selected products. So I'll give the example of sugar. So there was a sort of sugar shortage in 1973, 74, and even 75, which led to the creation of Sugar Protocol under Lome, although Britain also played a role in the creation of Sugar Protocol. Under the Sugar Protocol, the EEC had a quota where it paid sometimes 2 times, sometimes 2.5 the market value of sugar to certain countries. This led to many West African countries reallocating, if you like, allocating resources into developing sugar estates, most of which turned out to be unproductive investment. So Cote d'Ivoire is an example. If you study the debt crisis in 1980 in Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, which resulted to structural adjustment, there's a direct link between the sort of loan for establishing the 6 sugar estates. This is according to IMF reports, not my research. There's a direct link between that and the crisis that led to structural adjustment in Ivory Coast. So in the partnership's early days, resource misallocation and the prevention of diversification in West Africa were some of the significant political effects of this Yaoundé and also Lome Convention. Because ruling elites, this is not by design, it is because ruling elites in these countries used this trade agreement to negotiate their own political survival. So some of these shifted with Cotonou Convention, but there's no time for me to talk about Cotonou Convention because I want to move forward. So fast forward to the recent years, where we observe currently there's a profound shift in African policymakers and even researchers' perspective on the trade relations with the EU. I'll speak on just 2 developments. The first is integration in Africa, both regional and recently continental integration. So regional integration was promoted and even funded by the EU through the Economic Partnership Agreement from Cotonou. This had, because in order for the EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, to be implemented at the regional level, you need a common external tariff. So the EU funded regional integration in the early 2000s. Since the mid-2000s, African countries have formed effective regional alliances, which recently evolved into continental free trade. So this continental in 2018, 2019, about 54 African countries came together and signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The aim is to enhance intra-Africa trade, industrialization, diversification, and the development of regional value chains. This new continental integration is now seen as the pathway to structural transformation in Africa, to industrialization. Why the smaller regional alliances aligns well with the EPA as well as with the EU trade partnership, the continental free trade appear to contradict. There's no time for me to get into that. But more importantly, it aligns with Chinese development in Africa. So another key development now is the increasing engagement with other regions, particularly China. So the surge in Chinese production and infrastructure development in Africa is noteworthy. It has prompted many African countries to modify their development model. So by development model now, I mean the way African countries build infrastructures and also support domestic sectors, or the way they pursue structural transformation, basically industrial policy. So this is going to be a problem for the EU. That is how compatible. So the question I'm asking is, how compatible is the development model exported by China to Africa, this current shift, and the EU trade partnership? This is my question. Recently, the EU launched Global Gateway to counter Chinese investment. However, this initiative, has been underwhelming with very little disbursement. Historically, a significant portion of the aid component of this trade partnership, the European Development Funds, if you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, has remained undisbursed. So if you study the way the EU disburses promised aid to Africa, it's usually between 30 to 45%. They usually don't disburse everything. And the Global Gateway seems to be following this pattern. The EU now is beginning to sort of engage with African Union to sort of recalibrate Africa-EU partnership as a sort of formal political channel, going through a different channel. This approach has its limitation. One of the reasons is because the EU does not always respect, the West generally does not always respect African institutions. A notable example of this would be the Libya crisis in 2011, when the AU, that's African Union, came up with a negotiated settlement that was overlooked by the United States, by Britain, and by France. So to go back to my question, how compatible is the development model that is currently being exported by China to Africa, which Africans are adjusting to, and the EU partnership? There's this Yaoundé Convention to Lomé Convention to Cotonou to EPA and now to post-Cotonou. I think I'm running out of time, but in conclusion, why the trade partnership between the EU and Africa and African countries have evolved over the decades, it is crucial to reassess their alignment with current African ambition and sort of global dynamic. I believe the EU may be holding onto an outdated perception of influence in Africa as it assumes its impact remains as significant as it was, say, 20 or 40 years ago. It is simply not the case. Thank you very much.
That was, in a very short order, that was really wonderful, Michael. I appreciate that. You laid out quite a bit. And I'm going to turn it back to Catherine to introduce Abdou, but you're making me think that precisely in Dakar, the big museum that to African culture that's been built in Dakar was actually funded by the Chinese. And so there's a very different kind of development model. And this is something that in the conversation we'll continue to investigate. So, but Catherine, would you?
Yes, and it's actually interesting that you raised the issue of China and Africa. Yesterday, or on Friday, we had a full day seminar on Africa and China relations. So it really is, I think having these, our centers partnering on these discussions that bring together many different parts of the world is really critical. And so I would like to introduce our third panelist, Dr. Abdou Sek, who is a faculty member of the Department of the Center of Social Science Studies of Religion at Gaston Berger University in Senegal. He has a multidisciplinary background encompassing philosophy, anthropology, modern and contemporary African history, and has widely published on Islam, migration, and the question of the in-commons in Africa, West Africa, and Senegal. Alongside, he has also been active in building concrete links through, quote, third places between academic spaces and community initiatives for resilience. In 2020, during the first outbreak of COVID-19, he co-founded the Groupe d'Action des Études Critiques, GAEC, Afrique, a decolonial collective based in Saint Louis in Senegal. Currently, from September to December of this year, Dr. Seck is a senior fellow researcher at the Marion Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa at the University of Ghana, which is, I believe, where he is now. And it was a pleasure for Pernille and I to meet Abdou and his colleagues and the activists in Saint Louis. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to share on this very important topic. And welcome, Abdou.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I will also take a few minutes to, not just for the protocol, but truly to thanks very sincerely all you guys who have invited me to be part of this conversation. And this conversation is something very much important because it echoes also what we are trying to do right now in our countries. And I will just start by saying this. We're talking about 63 years, but I did not very much hear about celebration or commemoration. And I wonder, are we celebrating or are we commemorating? If I ask that question, that's because, as we have said earlier, our two first colleagues, that it's very much important also to precise the standing point. Because what I'm trying to do in my work as academic is to try to provoke a kind of new rewriting of intellectual history in Africa. Actually, what happens, Michael was talking about us, with us about this Rome Treaty, but I would go just a little back before the Treaty of Rome, because actually what we got in the Treaty of Rome directly came from to 1944, to what happens at Brazzaville, in this famous conference de Brazzaville, where we got no representative coming from the Africa, but the French was already preparing the afterwar. And that's something very much important happens in this conference de Brazzaville, because we can find the whole history of these Yaoundé things is already set in this conference. And also the ambiguity of the project are already there. So then they'll go to say, okay, no more colonization. They cut off the colonization, and they now need to figure out something new, something else to shape new relations. But at the same time, they were saying the Code de l'Indigène is abolished. At the same time, they were completely willingness to continue for 5 years again the forced labor. So this is something completely disturbing. At the same time, also, they were saying that no more colonization. De Gaulle himself was saying no self-government until very long. And the only we can actually discuss about all can be possible, but the only one thing is not possible. One only thing is not possible is that to envision the future without the French bloc. But actually, that French bloc is rise a kind of a bloc for French. And that bloc for French, that's what French sell somehow in this Treaty of Rome. Because remember, France was saying no treaty without integrating these former colonization territories in this colony. Also, this is something very much, I think we have never moved out from this conditions and genesis of this project, because Yaoundé has perpetuated, as it has been highlighted earlier, these configurations. Of course, I acknowledge Lomé. Of course, I acknowledge that somehow in the process, we do have passed from these regionalism things and what also the Americans has called an influence zone in favor for particularly Europe and the former countries they have colonized more than the others. Because also remember, in these 6 countries that they have set the CEE, 4 of them was the biggest one colonizers country. And this is something also important. So then, yes, the evolution of this Yaoundé Convention brought in the conversations, the change happens in the global ways. And what happens in the global ways is the neoliberalism, opening and opening and opening again and again the markets. And that contributes to depoliticize somehow, but also to erase memories about these instruments. And today, 63 years later, either we don't know if we are celebrating or commemorating, we can just then try to make a report and see what is happening here and there. And then I see Gabon, I see Mali, I see Burkina Faso, I see Senegal. Everywhere people are shouting, France dégage. And I think this is kind of response of what history has brought here before our eyes, and we do need to see it. And it brings me also to the questions of development. As I stated at the beginning, what we are trying to do as critical African scholars is to rewrite the history with new kind of tools. I'm not saying this because we want to add again and again things, all these things to know. Every single day you have new prophet in academia world, but it's not about this. This is about, even if we take this narrative on development, somehow we have no chance to be something else than victims. And when we look at the history with a kind of different lens, we see that what happens from 1946, when they set the 4th Republic, the 4th Republics, and the French Union, the kind of African elite at that time we used to have, that had been an elite that the youngest generation in the 50s and in the 60s has been strongly criticized. actually, what was their project within this big development project? My hypothesis is indeed they didn't want the independence. Not because, as we used to say, they were naive or they were under influence. They didn't want the independence, and they wanted to remain in these boxes because they wanted to get their part. They wanted a return of what they have, on how they had been treated. So not moving outside was actually something full with agency. I am part of this generation. They kept criticizing Senghor and all these leaders. But now I'm getting more cautious about how this African elite was doing by trying to be under this very bizarre architecture like Yaoundé, Lomé, and in this Euro-African relationship. I think whatever the critics we may formulate against them, whatever they are not a very much good leadership, they have done their best to try under their situation of dominated political class to extract and to take whatever they were able to take. But now time has changed. Time today has changed. I'm not thinking this new thing that, oh, China is here, China is here. Yet, China is here, but yet Europe still is the biggest trade partner for Africa. Europe still is the biggest intellectual standpoint influence in Africa. And that are also something very much important we have to take care. But also don't forget what is now happening from the ground, from the streets. This new generation, and this new generation is truly willingness to change the partnership history of the Africa to come. And I'm afraid that Europe is not playing a very much important role into this. Yeah, and thank you very much.
Such a rich conversation, and indeed, you take us, Michael, to where Abdul, to where Michael was also pointing and asking if the EU is holding to outdated perceptions, and really we're seeing a kind of arc throughout this back to Pernille's initial three questions: what is development, who gets to dictate it, and who benefits from it? And it really, it's really a good conversation already. So let me switch now to Mounir Saidani, and Mounir is in a place, Tunisia, that wasn't part of the Yaoundé conversation or Lomé, but it is Francophone. Let me just introduce Mounir first. He's currently the editor-in-chief of the Omran Social Sciences Periodical, issued by Arabb Center for Research and Political Studies in Doha. And prior to that, he was at the Center for Economic and Social Studies and Research, CERES, in Tunisia. He is a professor of sociology at the High Institute of Human Sciences in Tunis, Al-Manar University. And is interested in the socio-anthropology of culture, the kind of sociologist that I get very much get along with very well. He works on knowledge and art, socio-cultural change in contemporary Tunisia and the Arab world. He published several books and articles in Arabic, French, and English in Tunisia and abroad, and it has also been active as a translator of books and articles from French and English into Arabic. His latest publication is a massive report, 1,400 pages on the religious state in Tunisia from 2011 to 2015, a very intense time of transformation in the Arab world. It's a collective work, and he's a general supervisor and editor-in-chief. He's leading a multidisciplinary research unit working on knowledges, cultures, and social change. And I think one of the things just to say at the moment is that Africa is a continent. In the United States, it's also often confused as a country. The regions and the dynamics of Africa are really quite varied. But one of the things that we know is that precisely after Giorgia Meloni was elected, she and Ursula von der Leyen, so this Italian post-fascist leader and the head of the European Commission, traveled to Tunisia to discuss in many ways development, but also migration. And some Tunisia was particularly under the microscope of attention, intense attention from the European Union, and has developed in the contemporary moment some very controversial relations. And I'll stop and let Mounir give his introductory comments here.
Thank you very much, Randall. I want to thank you and Catherine for this opportunity, and also thank the European Studies Center for making me part of this discussion, very, very interesting discussion. Actually, I'm interested in and know more about North Africa than South Africa, so maybe I will give you some insights from North Africa, and I will participate in this discussion from this position. And I would say that as a sociologist, I'm interested in historical processes of making, demaking and remaking of social orders, social classes, and social groups, and especially elites as political ones, cultural ones, academic ones, and the constitution, reconstitution, or deconstitution of ideologies. And I'm talking about ideologies because I think that it is very important to introduce in our discussion all these concepts of development, of modernization, of colonial, colonization, decolonial, and I will try to make it part of my very short introduction here. And for this historical processes of making, remaking things, elites and ideologies, it is very, very hard to think about it or about them without having in mind that they were influenced by the European colonial presence in Africa as a colonial presence, or as a civilizational presence, or westernized presence, because this is I think very important, especially when we think about what was going on in 1963, because before July 1963 Yaoundé Convention, there was May 1963 Addis Ababa Constitution of the African Organization Unity. So we have these two moments separated from, one to the another with no more than 2 months, May to July. And we have here to some extent something like a conflictual process in making or remaking Africa or post-colonial Africa. I will try to explain more of this, because when we go to this Yaoundé Convention, it is all about trade, all about exchange as raw materials and then industrialized materials. When we go to the constitution of the Organization of African Unity, we can read about progress, about unity, about integrity, and about a lot of things that are more crucial for the future of Africa than trying to reconstitute itself as a continent. But I know that all of us, we know that after this Yaoundé Convention, there were a lot of moments, especially Michael reminded us some steps of them. So this was this conflictual process of remaking this post-colonial Africa, which was not in our times a decolonial reconstitution of Africa, because I think that the post-colonial Africa with this Yaoundé Convention was reconstituted as a new colonial or post-colonial model of implementing political elites as leadership in these countries. And we know that a lot of the parts of this political leadership trying to be part of this reconstitution of post-colonial Africa were in very, very tight relationship with the French elites and the French ideologies of modernization and of trying to have their countries as the closest more to European model of having relationship between political elites and governed people, and the relationship between urban areas and rural areas, and European model of building a relationship between classes and between elites. Let me give some insights about the scholar, for example, discussion about what is needed for reconstitution of Africa in the 60s and the 70s. And we can say that in sociology and in anthropology, for example, in social sciences, there were the, attempts to rebuild these sciences on a new model, what was called decolonizing knowledge about Africa and about the new phase of the history of Africa. But in the same time, when we look close to what was written, what was said in the 60s and the 70s, we can see that the ideology of modernization is still there. The ideology of modernization in the Western way were still there. So even in the scholarship, even in the scholar written texts, we can see that this moving from colonial to post-colonial, non-decolonial processes were very clear, and we can see that very clear. So moving to our times, we can see that the problems of building the post-colonial Africa are still there. We are still dealing with poverty. We are still dealing with non-national initiated processes of doing plans of economic strategy. We are still dealing with division in Africa. We have still this split between North Africa and South Africa. We are still dealing with problems that are initiating this massive immigration towards Europe. And that's why I think that the relationship between Africa, North Africa especially, and Europe is very, very influenced with these problems. And the European strategies are trying to deal with these problems in a securitarian vision. So this is another time a problem of building politics upon ideologies of considering Africa as a whole world which must be separated from Europe. And we can see that there is, for example, for this visit of Meloni, we can see that there is what is called that defrontierization of Europe. So the frontiers of Europe are not the Mediterranean Sea, but must move to Tunisia, for example, and the frontier of Italy are in the south of Tunisia or the south even of Libya, because Italians are considering that these waves of migrants are coming because Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco and Libya are not securizing their frontiers, so that immigrants are moving towards Europe, and they are seen as something which is very, very dangerous to Europe, as something which is to combat in Africa before they arrive to the frontiers of Europe. And this secularization of the politics of Europe towards North Africa is very dangerous, because it's remaking the old balance between Europe, which is considered as the countries of wealth, of modernity, of human beings who deserve to live as modern, and Africa, which is dealt with as jungle, as forest, as something which is very dangerous for Europe. And I will finish with some remarks about what is going on in the discourses towards Europe in North Africa. We have this popular or grassroots discourse, which considering that Europe is more and more difficult to move on, and it is more secularized. It is more and more racist towards North African who are living in Europe, especially in France, and towards North Africans or Africans who are living in Africa. So this is this issue of racism. There is this issue of migration, about what I talked a few minutes, and we have other discourses, for example, the political discourse. We have, for example, the political discourse of the leadership in Tunisia and in Algeria, which is becoming more and more virulent towards Europe because this politics of migration. But at the same time, we have other discourses who are developed in scholarship, in research, in social sciences research, and so on, which are moving towards positions of critiquing Europe and more deeply critiquing Europe as a racist, as a racist entity trying to defend itself towards this. And I think that, for example, for now, the Palestinian issue is very, very important because it's showing that what is said in all these discourses is true. Europe is acting as an enemy of people in Africa and in MENA region in general. Those are some remarks, and I will be very happy to respond to questions if there are questions. Thank you very much.
Of course, those are very compelling and profound remarks. And I think one of the things that we might consider is at this particular moment, when on the street in Europe, there's battles around anti-Semitism in France, but Islamophobia is on the rise as well, that part of what we're looking at is a long history in which anti-Semitism and racism are emergent from the same kinds of dynamics and relations, and hence it could be considered a dangerous success at the moment to be making distinctions between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, that the racist fear of Africa and the fear of the other in general have sources that are very much intertwined, and we have movements extracting them. But I want to step back and say that you've all provided an amazing set of prompts or responses and compelled my thinking. One of the things that's perhaps of interest is moving throughout all the comments, all the contributions here, is the way that resources. So Pernille started us out with an understanding that there's a historical transformation of interest in people / slaves, and then to land. And we might then describe to resources in a kind of industrial mode. And it seems that those kinds of dynamics, or those three ways of thinking about these processes, continue to unfold in the kind of discursive transformations that Mounir is pointing to, in which at this point people are a threat and not a resource, but rather a threat, and land as natural resource is something that's very important in the kinds of considerations here. I'm happy to, I actually wanted to underscore for those people in the audience that if you have any questions, please, just a reminder, put them in the Q&A and we'll draw them in. So I encourage you to join the conversation here. But at this point, let's sort of open it up and see if any of the other panelists now have a response to some of the things that we've been hearing throughout this conversation, and if anybody wants to add or expand some of the points that the colleagues on the panel have made.
I see that Abdu and Michael have both unmuted themselves. Is that a signal that you have a response?
Yeah, I just wanted to the issue on migration, and sort of racism and migration. I just wanted to touch on how this is sort of playing out in West Africa. So last year, after Russia invaded Ukraine, just last year alone, the EU, I think, took in almost 8 million migrants from Ukraine, so 7.8 million or something like that. And so this, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very good thing. But meanwhile, if you sort of contrast that to especially African migrants using the Mediterranean to sort of boat migrants moving from Libya to, I think, to Italy, which I think led to a great deal of controversy among European member states about rescue, whether some of them should be rescued, is about reception, reallocation duties. I think this in a way exposes, this has exposed the EU to accusations of double standard in the treatment of migrants and refugees from Ukraine on the one hand, and treatment of migrants and refugees from sort of Africa on the other hand. I attended an African Union meeting once. It was a Zoom meeting, and I was given a link. And even some of the members raised this particular issue. I mean, this is an issue that is discussed within Africans. They may not actually discuss it with Europe in their meetings, but Africans themselves discuss issues like this. I think that is very, very significant. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with taking in Ukraine, people from Ukraine, but to just contrast that to this sort of language you hear from 2015 onward, it's unbelievable actually. So I think that is a problem that I don't know how to do. I just wanted to just point that out. Yeah.
And I appreciate that we used to talk about the Arab street, but we could be talking about the African street on this level, that there is a kind of conversation that's going on. And some of what's been in this conversation is the difference between people and elites and leadership. And that might be something to explore what it is. But Abdou, you were going to also contribute. And if you're not, I actually wanted to go back to what you were saying about the revision of thinking about Senghor and about the willingness to stay in certain boxes, because I think then that also is about this question of, say, elite relationship to Europe, which might be different than the citizens, as it were, or maybe I was misunderstanding, but let's see what you were going to say, Abdou.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to get back to that idea of Eurafrique, and Eurafrique like Europe, Africa. It was also a concept that Senghor liked it very, very much. And I was wondering now what remains, what left, if you work around all these countries, North Africa, South Africa, what remains? So if you just work around and say Africa, and if you work around and say China, Africa, for example, the reaction is completely different. And that's why I think, yes, we still do have kind of structure and strong trajectories that still make Europe quite strong in Africa, but the tendencies are very much clear, showing us something completely different. But also what I wanted to truly say is, right now, what is the most important? the most important is truly about knowledge production. That's why I agree a lot with Mounir has shared with us. If you read story in a certain way, we keep perpetuate a narrative in which we have the feeling that people were just being dominated. But what I would suggest is probably these elites, yes, had been very much trained, educated. Maybe they were very much fascinated by Europe. But I'm talking about this African elite. They have negotiated through the 14, 15, and 16 the independencies. And they made choice that today people are very much angry against them. But I'm trying to find a way to pay them back something, like can't we reread what they have done somehow differently? Not by compassion or not by being laxist in the reading, but by being deeply critical and decolonial. And that's why I think that at the time that they were fighting to get autonomy within the large scale of discourses on the for example, that has been reminded us, like the French civilization, how they call it again, mission civilisatrice, you know, civilization. So then they try to get the autonomy, because the autonomy was completely a credit on the global time, because no more colonization, the Atlantic Chart, the United States, etc., etc. So then, but by claiming autonomies and trying, as even they were saying, these elites, that to show the genuineness of the people, but within the dominated discourses, I think this was not an defeated way, but something that acknowledged that the rapport de force was very much not in favor, and they tried to find a way, like the marronage mostly, and yeah. So then that, yeah, even though they were a weakness elites, they had tried to do their best.
Mounir, please. No, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to say that last year, in 2022, was organized in Tunisia the summit of the Francophonie, and it was very, very interesting occasion to rethink about the relationship between, which is to some extent the zone of influence of France, because this is this overlapping map of presence of French speaking language and written language and this zone of influence and of political influence, and this zone of economic and political presence of France in Africa. We know that Francophonie is wider than this relationship between France and Africa, but I think that it was a very interesting occasion to rethink this relationship between France and Africa. And I wrote a very small paper in Arabic. So, but if you are interested, I can send you the link. And I tried to see what is Francophonie for Africa. And I discovered that there are a lot of francophonies. And now, for example, in trying to have bridges between francophonie africaine or African francophonie and the other francophonies, and this French politics to try to rebuild the relationship between us. You can see that it is very hard to rethink this idea, this first idea of francophony as a group of African nations surrounding this ancient empire, which is France. And I think that this idea of empire is still there in the official French politics towards Africa. So we have this side of the relationship between Africa and Europe, which is between Europe as France and Europe as Germany and Europe as the rest of the countries, and Europe as United Kingdom, because we have this since 61 and then 66 and then 69, this Commonwealth which is splitting Africa between two major empires or ancient colonial empires. So I try to raise the impact of the historical processes of building the relationship between Africa and Europe as separated Africa and as separated Europe. And that's why I think that it is very hard to talk about Africa as a whole and Europe as a whole. We are still dealing with national conceptualized politics, European politics, towards a lot of Africas. And that's why I think partially, at least, that's why China, for example, can have this opportunities to be in Africa, because it's more easy to try to have some positions where there is no unified European politics towards Africa. Thank you.
But yet, okay, I'm just going to suggest that there might not be a unified politics, but there does seem to be unified economic interest. And one of the things that's coming out of this conversation is a sense that there's a big difference, and Mounir, you even observed that the sort of economic policies are national. That is to say, the African nations are being governed by economic policies that are not in their national interest, and some of that is partly because, or might I suggest, some of it is because they're actually creating negotiations not just with France, but with the 27-member trading bloc. And that really has a different impact because it creates a different economic incentive. And one of the things in these stories that you yourself observed is that the creation of the organization, the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, preceded Yaoundé. And it seems to me that part of the narrative that is coming out of the conversation is that collective organization on a massive scale meets and creates some kind of response from Europe on a large scale. And one of the things just to ask here is, I haven't heard anybody mention anything about the non-aligned movement. And it certainly is the case that other dates that we could include are 1955 with Bandung, and 1956, the Suez Crisis, 56, right? And the way that also created a very different kind of decolonized vision of what now we refer to as the global South, and that seems to me as something in this history that elicited an almost frightened response from Europe, that it was about to lose the control that it had. Or maybe you would see it, maybe you, the panelists here would see it differently. But Michael, I know that we had a question in the, which is related here. We had a question about the relations between Africa and Europe, and have they in general improved? And I think your response there might be of interest if you want to bring it into the conversation here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So the question, let me just read out the question. Do you think relations between Africa and Europe have improved for the better since the Yaoundé Convention? The second part is, can you say there is more equal power in decision making, or are things pretty much the same 60 years later? So in my response, I touched on two examples. I touched on the example of changes in the negotiation, the way I think this change really occurred during Lome Convention. So there has been a sort of move towards a more negotiation as opposed to imposition. So Yaoundé Convention could be, I mean, there was negotiation there, but it was mainly French imposition. However, the extent to which this has been more, it has led to sort of more equal decision making is debatable. That is, it is debatable whether we now have changes in negotiation dynamic or it is still in position. My view would be that African countries are actually very, especially the ruling elite, actually very, very smart in the way that they can get a lot from the EU, more than they get credit for. So the idea that this trade agreement are not in the interest of Africa, I think it's a little interesting. I don't go with that. I think it's more in the interest of the ruling elites in Africa as opposed to African countries. So the ruling elites, they, especially if you look like a case, especially in the former French colonies, if you look at, like, let me just give you an example of Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. The trade agreement may not actually be in the interest of Côte d'Ivoire as a country, but it definitely was the interest of the first president of Côte d'Ivoire, Mounir, who was president for over 30 years. So the other answer I gave is diversification of partner. African countries have diversified their international relations by engaging with emerging global players like China, India, Brazil, Turkey. This has given African countries more leverage in their relations with the EU, a broader set of options for trade, aid, investment. So Nigeria is the example of this. The EPA, Nigeria refused to sign the EPA. That's the Economic Partnership Agreement. The reason why Nigeria refused to sign it is not in their interest. So Ghana signed it, Côte d'Ivoire signed it. The rest of West African countries signed it, but Nigeria did not, because it's basically not in their interest. If you go to East Africa, I think, I'm not sure if it's Kenya or Tanzania did not sign it. If you go to COMESA, there's also at least 1 or 2 countries that did not sign it. There's a link between this diversification of partners and now more agency. So this is another change. So policy ownership, I think, would be another change. There's a sort of growing emphasis on African countries to establish their own development agenda and policies before negotiating. So if you study the post-Cotonou negotiations, so African countries came with an agenda. So in the past, the EU would set the agenda. So the Cotonou, the agenda was set. Lomé, the agenda was set. So I think these are some of the changes. So I know that the EU is still the main trading partner in Africa, but I think in Africa as a whole, but when you move to individual countries, there are so many countries where China is now the main trading partner. But I think the EU is gradually losing its influence in Africa, especially trade, aid, this development partnership. It's obviously losing its influence. The main influence that I think the EU still have, it's preferential access to EU market. So I'll give the example of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are the two biggest producers of cocoa in the whole world. So they now have cocoa processing in plants. To export cocoa products to anywhere, they would have to pay certain tariff, but they can export to the EU tariff-free under the current EPA. So Nigeria also have cocoa, Nigeria also produce cocoa, but Nigeria refused to sign the EPA. Exporting from Nigeria to the EU is more expensive. So a country like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire relying on cocoa will always value that trade relationship with the EU. So it's like continuation of, I think the first presentation is really got this really right. It's sort of continuation of that colonial trade model. So the EU through preferential trade access gave this preferential trade access to African countries because African countries keep on producing the same thing. They need this, market access. Now, this is where China comes in. The new development model and the continental free trade, if this can lead to diversification, i.e. African countries now producing other things, then the EU is no longer relevant, at least economically. So the example of this again would be Nigeria. So the EU is almost completely irrelevant if you study the industrial policy in Nigeria, the way Nigeria creates industrial policy. They don't even consider the EU at all. They even consider China, India more than they do the EU, because there's no market in the EU for their industrial products. So that is basically that's it.
I know that one of the first trade cases that was brought against the European Economic Community was Nkrumah. Precisely in this context of it was about the disruption of the banana trade and the way that Yaoundé was disrupting the buildup of the economy in time. It was interesting. We're coming to the end, and I wish we weren't. One of the things that I would add in here that sounds that Michael and maybe the other panelists are. We heard from Abdou something that I would describe as from Brazzaville speaking above the heads of people to a slow move towards actually trying to be at eye level with each other from Michael's comments right now. And I know that in the literature around development that there's been a transformation from development aid to development cooperation. And to think about that as a different kind of partnership. But I'm wondering, Pernille, if you might have the last words. I don't want to put you on the spot, but the questions that you raised at the beginning, I found them bringing things to such a point in the conversation here that I've been continually thinking through what we've been what we've been hearing through those questions, and if you have any final thoughts that would take us out of our conversation on Africa and Europe today.
Well, I can try, and that will be to say what most historians will say, which is that it's still too soon to tell, right?
That's very good. But all right, if you want to stop there, that's good, because we really are at time. And Catherine, if I think you would join me in thanking our panelists here and really providing a very, very, very detailed and rich conversation that has touched on so many things. I learned quite a bit, and I'm grateful. So
yes, I do. I echo your thanks and appreciation, and I'm glad we've recorded this because it is there for many other students and scholars to learn from. So thank you so much for your time, your contributions, and your insights. It's been an honor to have this with you.
Thank you very much.